Hi, I'm Ryan Speakman. This is These Final Days Ministries, and welcome to episode number 23 of our series, The Truth About the Rapture. So we've been looking at the Olivet Discourse. This is Jesus' great end times dissertation. It's his last sermon before he went to the cross, and it's his second longest sermon besides the Sermon on the Mount. And what we're looking for is a very clear, overt, plain, linear, simple chronology of the last days that tells us in no uncertain terms when the rapture is going to happen in relation to the 7-year Great Tribulation and the time of the Antichrist. So no small challenge for us. We've been spending several weeks in this chapter so far. This is Matthew chapter 24. The sermon is actually covered through Matthew chapter 25, but we're focusing right now on the prophecy portion of this teaching that Jesus gave, which actually is not very long. It's 28 verses, Matthew chapter 24, verses 4 through 31. And again, in here, what we're hoping to find, what we're expecting to find, is a clear chronology that tells us when the rapture is going to happen. Is it pre-tribulation, mid-tribulation, pre-wrath, post-tribulation? And So, again, no small challenge for us, but as we're going to see, it's surprisingly clear. So we're taking our time looking at this. I want us to really understand what Jesus is teaching. We want to get a clear understanding of his prophecy so that really by the time that we're done, there's just no doubt that we can look at this and say in no uncertain terms, yes, Jesus does tell us precisely when the rapture is going to happen. Why are there so many disparate theories? If that's the case, well, we'll talk about that later. But in the meantime, so we've been working our way through, one verse at a time, essentially. And we've gotten to a point in the passage here. We're still in the pre or the period of time leading up to the Great Tribulation. So in the prophecy, we're not quite up to where Jesus talks about the 7-year Great Tribulation. But what we're looking at now is Jesus's description of events and conditions that are going to transpire on the earth in the years and decades and centuries, a couple centuries leading up to this period that we know as the Great Tribulation. So let's look again very quickly at the verses that we're studying at the moment. So this is Matthew chapter 24, verses 6 through 8. And here Jesus says, "And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows." So what we've talked about in the last couple of episodes, we've looked at the first three indicators or parameters that Jesus mentions there. So we looked at some actual charts and graphs, statistics of wars and conflicts between nations and peoples over the last many centuries. We were able to go back quite a ways, looking at the number of wars, number of casualties, how widespread wars are, etc. And maybe not surprisingly, what we found is that in fact, indeed, wars and conflicts are increasing dramatically in our time. So even as humans, we imagine that, we're getting better at peace and diplomacy, and can't we all just get along? The opposite is true. Just in the last couple of decades, even since World War II, we're seeing more wars now, more atrocities, more conflicts, more casualties. War is more brutal than it's ever been before. So in spite of all of our best efforts, the United Nations and all of the enlightenment that we've supposedly achieved, in the last, few decades or few centuries, it's just not working. And we went on from there. We looked at statistics and trends regarding famine and hunger throughout the world. Likewise, very much on the increase, surprisingly, just in the last, half century, the last couple of decades. So there again, in spite of all of our best efforts, all of the humanitarian aid, nonprofit organizations, the United Nations, we're just not beating this problem. We're not overcoming it. We're not solving it. Hunger and famine is greatly on the rise in our generation. We also looked at pestilences. So what pestilence refers to is actually disease. So diseases that affect humankind. And we talked about AIDS, which is kind of the big one that maybe comes to mind, but we don't want to oversimplify that issue. So we also looked at a lot of really common ailments, right? Kidney disease and cancer and thyroid disease and strokes and Alzheimer's, heart disease. And all of those are surprisingly greatly on the increase, on the rise in our generation. So is this what we would expect to see? We've made the point that when Jesus spoke these words 2,000 years ago, all these things were happening in his day too. So what did he mean that we would see these things, in the years immediately preceding his return? So a good guess is that what he was telling us is that they're going to become a lot more widespread, a lot more frequent, a lot more severe. That does correlate with the first 6 seals, particularly the first 4 seals, what we call the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in Revelation chapter 6, which again, we're not going to take the time just yet to dive into that. It's very complex. But there, the Apostle John clearly tells us that that's really what we can expect to see. All these things that have happened throughout history, but in our generation, assuming that we're the last generation before Christ returns, and I definitely assume that. I think most of us probably do. We should see a great dramatic increase, a globalization of these things. That is what we're seeing. So that brings us to the final parameter, the final indicator that Jesus mentioned, which is earthquakes. And I said in the last episode that I'm really excited about this one. This one's particularly interesting to me because, the other stuff, wars and famines and even diseases, we can kind of, maybe make the argument, well, that's our own fault. It's, because of, humans are getting greedier and we're getting better at killing each other. And nations are greedy in relation to other nations. So a lot of nations are just so poor that the people are starving. That makes sense. Even diseases, there's pollution. We're not feeding ourselves, properly. People are traveling more, so diseases spread more easily. So, all these are factors that we can kind of pin, on ourselves. And kind of makes sense though. Are these things caused by human beings? I'm going to comment on that a little bit later in this episode, but earthquakes though, can we really pin that on humans? Well, hypothetically, there's a process in extracting oil and gas from the earth that's called fracking. Probably a lot of you have heard that. It's a short term for fracturing. So it's known as fracking, and what the idea is there, what the engineers do is they inject high pressure fluid into deep underground in an attempt to fracture the bedrock down underneath us to make it easier for them to extract oil and gas. And the theory is that this process is causing a great increase in seismic activity. So here again, is it caused by humans? Is it not caused by humans? But the big question is, are earthquakes on the rise? So let's take a look at our first graph here, our first statistics. This is based on United States Geological Survey data. Okay, so if you go to their website, you're going to see this exact chart, the USGS. I think it's usgs.gov. What do we see here? So this only goes back to 1975. It goes up to 2015. So it covers, a few decades, again, in our generation. And we see just a dramatic increase in earthquake activity. So this is showing us the number of earthquakes of magnitude 3 or greater. Now look at the little inset scatter point graph. What do you see there? That's most of you should recognize that as the central and eastern United States. So the purpose of this particular graph is to discuss this issue of fracking, because a lot of fracking is taking place, in this region and also throughout the world. But I think mainly in this region. So what do we see here? We see again a great dramatic increase in the number of this size of earthquake from 1975 to the year 2015. So earthquakes are a little bit tricky to discuss and analyze, because we can look in historical documents that date back even thousands of years, and we can see mentions of major earthquakes. But really, the ability to measure earthquakes on a daily, worldwide basis has not been around for very long. I mean, maybe over the last 100 years we can get good data. And when we're talking about something like earthquakes, we want to analyze earthquake activity, this kind of activity, on what we would refer to as a geological timescale, which means very long periods of time. I mean, for our purposes, it would be at least useful to be able to go back a couple thousand years. But unfortunately, we just can't do that. But we kind of don't need to. I mean, when we see numbers that are this dramatic, it looks like something is happening. Is this just natural trend? We would see this. Look at taking any snapshot of a 40-year period, 50-year period, even a 100-year period of human history or of world history. Would we kind of see these same kind of trends happen or not happen? I'm going to guess no. This is just major upswing in earthquake activity. You'll see it more. Let's look at a couple more graphs here. You'll see what I'm talking about. So in our next graph here, now the previous graphs I mentioned was just covering the central and eastern United States. This graph is more useful. It covers approximately the same time period, not quite as long. It starts in the same year, 1973. This chart ends at about 1998, 99. And what do we see here? The same thing, a very clear upward trend of earthquake activity. This chart is showing, or this graph is showing, earthquakes of magnitude 2.5 or greater, so about the same. What's different about this one, and you'll see, down below, this is also based on USGS data, so it's good numbers. This graph, though, this is showing us worldwide earthquake activity, so it's not just in the United States where the majority of fracking is happening. This is worldwide earthquake data. We're seeing the same thing just in my lifetime. Tremendous upswing in earthquake activity. If you go to the USGS website, again, I believe it's usgs.gov, that's the United States Geological Survey website, you'll see there that geologists are talking about this, and these are secular guys. They're not coming from a position of what we're talking about here, Bible prophecy, but they say it. They say yes. Over the last few decades, dramatic increase in earthquake activity, and they're trying to figure it out. So it's happening now. The next chart here, this is a bar chart. This is really useful. I love this one because this shows worldwide earthquake activity, again, based on USGS data. Now, these are big earthquakes. This is between magnitude 6 and 8. So these are much larger earthquakes. These are the ones that cause damage and deaths and injuries to people. And this chart actually covers over 100 years of human history, all the way back to 1901. And this chart goes through 2011, so pretty recent. And look at that. I mean, it's just unmistakable. Just a tremendous, dramatic. So you see what I mean? I mean, we could argue, well, this is just kind of a natural phenomenon, and you could argue that, but correlating what we're seeing here with what we've seen over the last couple of episodes. Wars and conflicts and hunger and famine and pestilences, diseases, all the charts are looking the same. I mean, all of these indicators that Jesus gave, whatever we want to attribute it to, everything is lining up, even as we see here earthquakes, dramatic increase in major earthquake activity just over the last couple of decades. So it really feels like something is happening, that we're headed towards some, major climax of human history, doesn't it? And, things like this, I mean, we don't know until we know. I mean, we can't say for sure when the 7-year Great Tribulation is going to happen. When it starts, we'll know. But in the meantime, we're supposed to be watching for these signs. And to me, it's just, I don't know, it's pretty clear, isn't it? I want to look at one more thing that Jesus doesn't directly mention, but it is interesting. This came up in my research. I saw this. Let's look at natural disasters in general. So this graph, this covers the period 1980 through 2010, so fairly recent. The bottom line, the red line, shows us geophysical events, which is earthquakes, which we've just been discussing. And it doesn't look as dramatic of a rise here, but it's just the scale of the graph that we're looking at. But if you see the black dotted straight line that follows the red line, clearly an upward trend of earthquake activity, and this also couples earthquake activity with tsunamis, which is tidal waves, and volcanic eruptions. And then look up above those other two lines. The light green line, or the green line, is meteorological events covering the last several decades, which is storms, so hurricanes, tornadoes, just major violent storms of any kind. What do we see there? Dramatic increase in this kind of activity. The kind of blue or greenish blue, aqua blue line, is hydrological events, which is floods and mass movement, which would be avalanches, mudslides, things like that. There again, major upswing over the last few decades. So all these things seem to be lining up. It's just fascinating to me. And I mean, there again, can we blame humankind for this? And, we could talk about global warming, things like that. I always find it kind of interesting that the Christians seem to take offense to the idea of global warming, like, it's just not happening. Scientists are making that up. I don't want to try to, I don't want to take a real strong position on that. I mean, I haven't researched it thoroughly myself, but everything that humans do, is it causing the earth to get better or worse? Everything that we've seen here, clearly it's the latter. Humankind is not having a good effect on this planet. God made us stewards over this planet. We brought in sin. We haven't done a good job. And we're seeing the manifestation of this in our time on a very dramatic scale. So, global warming, is it real? Is it not real? Why would we as Christians be so resistant to that idea? I mean, the idea is that, humans are causing the destruction of this planet. For Christians, that should not be hard for us to swallow. The Bible says that that's going to be the case. And there's one more graph I want to show you that's just fascinating to me, and it's not. This isn't something that I can really find anything in Scripture that tells us that this is going to be one of the things that happens. But it's just so dramatic, and it just lines up so well with everything else, and it relates directly to this question of, are we causing these problems ourselves? This is a graph showing recent history population growth. So it says recent history. It's not so recent. This goes back to the year 1000, and then it forecasts up to about the year 2200. So we get a little bit of a forecast projection there, but the real data ends, if you see the line there, right at about the year 2000 on this particular graph. And look at that. I mean, again, I keep using this word dramatic, but it is dramatic. Just an extreme upswing in human population, starting right about the time of the American Revolution, late 1700s. And if you read my book, These Final Days Part 1, that's the book sitting behind me here, and I do a little commercial at the end of every video if you want to stick around and watch that. But in my book, I analyze the first four horsemen of the apocalypse. That's what we call the first four of the seven seals in the book of Revelation. Again, correlates directly with what we're talking about here. And personally, I think that the first horseman rode out around the time of the American Revolution. There's a reason for that. And this is something else that we see that started about that time, is this extreme upward swing, this upward trend of the population of humans on this planet. Now, if we were to look at population data all the way back thousands of years, back to the time of Abraham or earlier, go back to Noah, however far you want to go back, it would just be kind of a very slight, steady rise in human population on Earth. But here again, look at this graph. Right around the time of the American Revolution, it just starts to dramatically upswing, and now it's almost beyond control. So again, this relates directly to this question of is this mankind's fault? I mean, the more humans that we get on this planet, that means the more sin that we have on this planet, right? So sin is not carried within your cat or your dog or the tree out in your yard. Sin is housed within each human being, and if we're born again, that's washed away from us and cleansed. So there are some righteous among us, but are the number of righteous in this world keeping up with the number of unrighteous? Of course not. Righteousness is falling rapidly behind unrighteousness in this world, and the population explosion is just going to contribute to that, obviously. So in other words, the world is getting darker. It's not getting lighter. It's getting darker. And does the Bible tell us anything about, this concept, this question, is mankind causing this? Is it our fault? Again, God made us stewards over this planet. He gave us dominion over this world. We brought in sin. We have not done a good job of managing this planet. This is something that God is sending Jesus back to correct. This is the purpose, one of the purposes of the 7-year Great Tribulation, to start this cleansing process. Now look what the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 8, verses 19 through 22, and it makes this point beautifully. Verse 19, Paul writes, For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. So what does that mean, revealing? That means redemption. He's referring specifically there to the second coming of Christ and the resurrection of the righteous dead and the rapture of those of us who are alive at that time, the revealing of the sons of God. Verse 20, for the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him being God, who subjected it in hope. So what that means is that creation, nature, plants, animals, just this world, didn't want to be subjected to sin, what we brought in. It's not the rest of the world's fault, but God subjected it in hope. What was the hope? The hope was that we would choose righteousness over sin. And again, a lot of us are choosing righteousness over sin. We're choosing to follow God. We're choosing to accept Christ. And so God's hope is going to pay off eventually. But in the meantime, we just see what's happening in our world. Verse 21, because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption. So all these terrible things we see happening in the world, creation's going to be delivered from this when Jesus returns, into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now. And I think that last verse, really sums it up for us. The whole creation is groaning with birth pangs. It just is greatly anticipating the return of Christ and the establishment of God's manifest kingdom here on earth. We call that the millennial reign, or at least it begins with the millennial reign. And that is coming. It's coming at the end of the 7-year Great Tribulation. So we see the trends. We see what's happening. We know where it's headed. It's actually very exciting, I think. I mean, we're a chosen generation. We're the ones who are seeing these things come to pass. So that's it for today. I think I went way over time today, but I appreciate your patience and sticking with me. I hope and I believe that you're getting a lot out of this, and I'm getting a lot as I put these studies together. That's for sure. But like I always say, I'm praying for all of you. I love you. I appreciate you so much. I love all the interaction on Facebook and YouTube. And some of you get angry with me and don't like what I'm teaching, but you're watching the videos and you're participating in the discussion. I greatly appreciate that. So I encourage all of you, as always, please stay filled with the Holy Spirit in these times. The days are growing darker. We need to be lighter. Stay rooted and grounded in God's Word in these final days. God bless you, and see you next week.
Ryan's new book, These Final Days, Part 1, The Truth About the Rapture, the Four Horsemen, and the Prelude to the Great Tribulation, is the first in a series that will revolutionize your understanding of what the Bible really says about these final days. Don't miss this groundbreaking book. Get it now at Amazon or at thesefinaldays.org. Also available on Kindle and iBooks.